But for the time being, we're not setting ourselves up to weather when global conditions change against us. We're not ensuring that we're protected in that way, that we have the necessary mechanisms and food supply measures in place if things go badly.
As inflation skyrockets, could there be a risk of further social unrest in South Africa? Well, joining me to discuss is my colleague, Chris Hattingh. So, Chris, we are seeing prices rising around the world. South Africa is the same. And also waves of protests in places like Kenya. Sri Lanka has had their government toppled. What is, in your view, the link between inflation and growing political instability?
Thanks very much, David. Well, when food prices increase as a result of tighter economic conditions around the world, we see people becoming frustrated because their money doesn't go as far as it used to in terms of just supplying basic staples for themselves and their families. When it's more difficult and expensive to transport your food across road or rail, that filters down into both the businesses that supply the food, but also for consumers in getting that food. When you also have lower economic growth prospects, as we're likely to see for this year and into the next 2 to 3 years, people's money isn't as flexible as it used to be. They have to make more difficult decisions in terms of what they buy. And all of that spills over into general frustration with society, with governments, with the status quo. And unfortunately, that sometimes manifests in very destructive ways. As of December 2021, the FOA Global Food Price Index, which is a global measure of selected agricultural commodity prices, was up by 21% year on year. And that was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That invasion is severely affecting food supplies to North African countries. So we're likely to see more social frustration and instability in that region. And in terms of May this year, countries such as Zambia, Kenya, Brazil, and the US have all seen their consumer food price inflation averaging more than 10% year on year. And by comparison, South Africa's consumer food price inflation index has averaged 7.8%.
All right. So, Chris, South Africa is blessed with a very productive agricultural sector. It's not without its challenges. I mean, if you consider the last few years, EWC has been on the policy agenda that's created a lot of uncertainty. But a big part of our export profile is agricultural goods, soft commodities, and there's been a real boom there. But now, to what extent do you think that these global risks in terms of food prices are going to start spilling over into South Africa? We obviously have inflation now at around 6.5%. It's above the Reserve Bank's target threshold of 3 to 6%. There's energy prices obviously going up in South Africa quite considerably. Do you think that we are facing similar risks here?
I think you're absolutely right to point to the policy risks and that it presents a sort of an unstable floor for South Africa going forward. So just because we've had good global conditions in terms of rising commodity prices, and just because we've had the good luck of good weather the last 2 to 3 years, resulting in good harvests and good bumper crops, doesn't mean that those conditions will persist going forward. And when you have the wrong policy framework in place, you expose yourself more to that risk. It's almost, if you think of an earthquake that might occur when you have the fault lines in place as a result of the wrong policies, then you're going to expose yourself and your country more to when global events maybe change against you, along with expropriation without compensation still being on the table. South Africa's general trade infrastructure is quite weak. We're very inefficient in terms of moving goods and material across railways, especially where those railways still exist, where the networks haven't been completely stripped and aren't inefficient. And of course, getting goods into and out of our ports. We now see more traffic going towards Mozambique and Namibia especially. So that means that the South African ports are not getting as much goods as they used to. And we're not seeing the necessary upgrades to get things through there. So for the time being, we're lucky. There are certain mechanisms in place which ensure that just because we export a lot of food, it doesn't mean that we'll just continue exporting ad nauseum. There will be certain triggers and mechanisms which indicate to local producers and governments when exports reach too much and that they should change in terms of local supply and demand. But for the time being, we're not setting ourselves up to weather when global conditions change against us. We're not ensuring that we're protected in that way, that we have the necessary mechanisms and food supply measures in place if things go badly.
All right. So, Chris, we in our exclusive client risk alert, we flagged the risk of social unrest repeating. There was a very interesting paper by the IMF, which we flagged as potentially instructive as to the likelihood of social unrest repeating in countries which have recently experienced social unrest. Could you elaborate on that for our audience?
Right. So in that paper, the authors point to the increased likelihood that a country will experience political and social instability if it has experienced such events in the preceding 12 months. And of course, in South Africa, we had the riots in July last year in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. So we're right in that time frame. And I think with rising inflation in the country, with tighter economic conditions, I mean, we might get 1.7 to 1.8% growth this year if we're lucky. With those ingredients in place and mounting social frustration with the current government, we shouldn't be surprised if more riots occur in the latter half of this year, and businesses and communities need to be aware of that risk, have the information, and prepare accordingly. If we also just look at, we mentioned the policy risks and why those set South Africa up to be more fragile going forward. If you look at inflation, food inflation specifically, when transport prices increase, when it's more costly for you to put fuel in your truck, to make sure that your warehouse is well stocked, for example, that refrigeration happens well, that you've got the diesel that you need to fuel your generator, because Eskom isn't always going to provide you with reliable electricity. When the transport costs increase, those are a big factor influencing rising food price inflation. So it is within government's power to alleviate some of the pressures of inflation, but we need to, again, get those trade policy factors right. If we could just move more goods across our railways, that would already alleviate a lot of the pressure on our roads, number one, but also alleviate some of the costs in terms of moving goods and materials and foods across our roads.
Right. Well, Chris, one factor to look at is the depreciation of the currency, the rand. Do you think that could be fueling some of these increased costs that we're seeing in SA?
Absolutely. When a currency doesn't go as far as it used to as a result of depreciation, then consumers and businesses struggle to ensure that they can keep their operations going as much as they used to in the past. If we look at countries such as Kenya and Nigeria, especially, where they have larger subsidies for fuel, they've got elections in coming months. And will those governments be able to sustain those subsidies when currencies depreciate? Governments are also not able to buy as much as they used to beforehand. Their budgets shrink, and they have to make more difficult choices with what they spend on. So welfare programs, for example, might be cut or at least pared down. And of course, subsidies of all forms might also need to be eliminated. When a currency also weakens as a result of rising interest rates in richer countries, that exacerbates matters. So we're likely to see rising interest rates again from the US Fed based on how high inflation numbers were for June this year. That'll again put pressure on emerging market reserve banks and central banks to increase their rates. So we're likely to see another rate increase from the South African Reserve Bank at its next meeting, possibly 50 basis points, maybe even 75. And that will again make economic conditions in South Africa itself more difficult.
Chris Hattingh, thank you very much. I'm going to be taking a break from the YouTube channel for a couple of weeks, but we will continue with our daily YouTube videos. You will be in the capable hands of Chris Hattingh. You may see me appear from time to time. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.